Picture this. You are sitting at your desk on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Maybe it is raining outside. Maybe there is a cup of coffee beside you that went cold an hour ago and you have not gotten around to reheating it. And you open your investment account, and the number staring back at you finally has 7 digits. $1 million. You did it. For a moment, maybe 10 seconds, a wave of relief washes over you, the feeling of finally arriving somewhere, of finally being able to exhale. And then, almost immediately, a quieter and far less comfortable question creeps in behind it. Now what? A great deal of time goes into thinking about money, not in the obsessive stock ticker watching sense, but in the sense of trying to understand why a single number can make a person feel safe and terrified in the same breath. What does money actually do to people? How does it change the way they sleep, the way they argue with the people they love, the way they make decisions about their careers, their children, their futures? And a particular amount of thought has gone into what it actually means, in practice, to retire on $1 million. Because most people seem to fall into one of two camps. Either they wildly overestimate what that number can do for them, or they undersell it so badly that they end up working another decade they never needed to work. What follows is an honest look at what retirement on $1 million actually looks like. Not in theory, not on a spreadsheet with clean and frictionless assumptions, but in real life with real expenses, real emotional swings, and real market behavior that has no idea what your retirement date is and does not particularly care. By the end of this, the goal is for that number to mean something genuinely different to you than it did a few minutes ago. And more importantly, for you to walk away with a clearer sense of the questions worth asking before you actually get there. Start with the figure most people have already heard somewhere, the 4% rule. If you have spent any amount of time around personal finance content, you have run into this one. The basic premise is that if you have $1 million invested, you can withdraw 4% of it annually, which works out to $40,000 a year, and statistically, your portfolio should be able to sustain that pace for roughly 30 years without running dry. The idea traces back to research from the late 1990s commonly known as the Trinity Study, and it has functioned as the foundational framework for retirement planning ever since. $40,000 a year sounds reasonable enough. That works out to a little over $3,000 a month, which most people could live on. Here is where it is worth pausing, because this number gets repeated so often that people start treating it as gospel, and the reality is a little more complicated. The 4% rule was built on historical stock and bond returns, largely from a period of remarkable economic growth in the United States during the middle of the 20th century. Whether the coming decades will mirror those same conditions is a genuinely open question. A number of financial researchers have begun suggesting that in the current environment, with lower bond yields and stock valuations that are more stretched than they once were, a more conservative withdrawal rate, somewhere around 3 to 3.5%, might be the wiser approach. That brings annual income down to $30,000 or $35,000, and the math suddenly feels noticeably tighter. And that is before taxes enter the picture. If that $1 million is sitting in a traditional retirement account, which is where most people's savings actually live, every dollar withdrawn is taxed as ordinary income. A $40,000 withdrawal, after federal and potentially state taxes, often becomes closer to $32,000 to $36,000 actually landing in the bank account. $3,000 a month, perhaps closer to $2.5. None of this is meant to be alarming. It is meant to be accurate, because the people who tend to retire most successfully are the ones who went into it with clear eyes rather than optimistic arithmetic. Here is something about income that rarely gets discussed honestly. It is not a fixed experience. $40,000 a year in a small town in rural Tennessee can mean a genuinely comfortable life. $40,000 a year in San Francisco, New York, or Seattle is a different story entirely, one that should make anyone reconsider their plan. It helps to walk through what a realistic monthly budget actually looks like for a single retiree living on $40,000 annually, roughly $3,300 a month. Because seeing it broken into ordinary human terms makes it real in a way that abstract percentages never quite manage. Housing tends to claim the largest share. Even for someone who owns their home outright, which describes many people who reach the $1 million mark, there are still property taxes, insurance, and maintenance to account for, typically somewhere between $600 and $1,000 a month once everything is averaged out. For someone renting, depending on the market, that figure could run anywhere from $1,200 to $2,000 a month for housing alone, which changes the entire retirement equation on its own. Healthcare is the other major variable, and arguably the most underestimated one. Retiring before the age of 65, before Medicare eligibility begins, means covering private health insurance, which, depending on health status, state of residence, and chosen plan, can run anywhere from $400 to $800 a month or more for a single person. Even after Medicare begins, there are still premiums for Part B and supplemental coverage, along with out-of-pocket costs that tend to grow with age. Healthcare deserves far more attention in retirement planning than it typically receives, and sitting honestly with that expense before walking away from a career matters more than most people realize. Food, transportation, utilities, and personal care round out the basics, and by the time those are accounted for, total expenses typically land somewhere around $2,500 to $2,800 a month for someone living modestly and owning their home free and clear. That leaves perhaps $500 to $800 for everything else: travel, hobbies, gifts for grandchildren, the occasional dinner out. It is livable, genuinely livable, but it is not lavish. For anyone picturing a retirement filled with cruises, a beach house, and regular flights to visit family, the math at $1 million becomes noticeably harder to stretch. There is one risk worth sitting with carefully, because it tends to get almost no airtime in casual conversation, despite being arguably the single largest financial threat to early retirement. Imagine retiring on January 1st with $1 million. The withdrawals begin at $40,000 a year, and then the market drops 30% within the first 2 years of retirement. Suddenly, the portfolio is not worth $1 million anymore. It is worth $600,000. Perhaps $650,000, even while withdrawals continue. And when the market eventually recovers, it is recovering from a much smaller base. Long-term average returns look fine on paper, but the timing of this particular downturn lands at precisely the worst possible moment. This is known as sequence of returns risk, and it explains why two people with identical portfolios and identical withdrawal strategies can end up with wildly different outcomes depending entirely on whether they happen to retire into a bull market or a bear market. There is a useful way to picture this. Imagine two people, person 1 and person 2, each with the same $1 million and the same 4% withdrawal rate. Person 1 retires in 1999. Right before the dot-com collapse, and then faces the 2008 financial crisis a few years later. Person 2 retires in 2009, just as the market begins recovering. Person 1 may genuinely run the risk of outliving their money by their late 70s or early 80s. Person 2, given the same starting balance and the same withdrawal rate, is likely sitting on more money today than when they started. Identical $1 million, entirely different outcomes, purely as a function of timing. The practical defense against this risk is something often called a cash bucket strategy, keeping 1 to 2 years of living expenses in cash or short-term bonds, held separately from the invested portfolio, so that if the market drops sharply in the first year or two of retirement, there is no need to sell equities at the worst possible moment. Living expenses get covered from the cash bucket, while the rest of the portfolio has time to recover. It is not a glamorous solution, but it functions as a meaningful buffer against what could otherwise become a retirement-ending stretch of bad timing. Social Security deserves real attention here as well, because it plays an enormous role in the actual math of retiring on $1 million, and a significant number of people in their 40s and 50s have quietly written it off, assuming either that it will not exist by the time they retire or that it will be too small to matter, and mentally removing it from their planning altogether. Both assumptions are probably mistaken. The Social Security Trust Fund does face real long-term funding pressure. That part is true, but the program itself is not disappearing. The most credible projections suggest that even without any legislative changes, Social Security would still be able to pay out roughly 75% of scheduled benefits beyond 2030. And given that meaningfully cutting Social Security tends to be politically untenable for any elected official, most analysts expect some combination of adjustments. Whether that means raising the payroll tax cap, modifying benefits for higher earners, or raising the retirement age, well before any serious cut reaches current or near retirees. What does that mean practically? Someone expecting $1,800 a month from Social Security at full retirement age is looking at $21,600 a year. Combined with a $40,000 portfolio withdrawal, that brings total income to roughly $61,600 a year. A meaningfully different retirement, with more room for healthcare costs, more room for travel, more room to actually breathe. And here is a detail that tends to surprise people. Delaying Social Security from age 62 to age 70 increases the monthly benefit by roughly 76%. Every year of delay past full retirement age adds approximately 8% to the eventual benefit. For anyone able to live off their portfolio for a few extra years and delay claiming, that delay essentially functions as purchasing a significantly larger guaranteed income stream for the rest of their life, a trade-off that rarely gets the attention it deserves. There is something worth mentioning here that goes slightly beyond the financial mechanics. A considerable amount of observation, both direct and through research, points to a pattern among people who retire with what looks like enough money. The ones who struggle are usually not struggling financially, at least not at first. They are struggling psychologically. Retirement gets marketed as an endless vacation. No alarm clocks, no commutes, no meetings that could have been an email. For the first few months, that genuinely feels wonderful. But people are, by nature, creatures of purpose and structure, and when the scaffolding of work disappears, not just the income, but the identity, the routine, the built-in social contact, many discover something uncomfortable. They miss it. Or more precisely, they miss what it was quietly providing without their realizing it. The people who retire most successfully tend not to be the ones running away from work. They are the ones who have built a clear, vivid picture of what they are running toward. They have projects, community, and travel plans that are concrete rather than vague daydreams. They have cultivated friendships and hobbies outside their professional identity long before retiring. They have thought through what an ordinary Tuesday at 11 in the morning actually looks like when there is no meeting on the calendar and nowhere in particular to be. It may sound sentimental, but it stands as one of the most underrated parts of retirement planning. $1 million can sustain a modest, careful lifestyle, but money alone does not sustain a person. One pleasant surprise many new retirees encounter is that their tax situation, when structured thoughtfully ahead of time, can actually work in their favor. This is an area where deliberate planning in the years leading up to retirement can make a real difference in how far that $1 million actually stretches. For someone with savings split between a traditional retirement account and a Roth account, there is real flexibility available. Roth withdrawals come out completely tax-free, so a $40,000 withdrawal need not all come from a taxable source. $20,000 might come from the traditional account, taxed as ordinary income, while the other $20,000 comes from the Roth account. Untaxed, donned carefully, this keeps someone in a very low effective tax bracket, while still living comfortably. There is also a strategy known as Roth conversion laddering, where in the early years of retirement, particularly before Social Security begins and while income is temporarily low, money gets converted from a traditional account into a Roth account and taxed at that lower rate rather than waiting and potentially paying more later. It functions a little like deliberately filling up a low tax bracket while the opportunity exists, knowing that a future version of yourself will benefit from having tax-free money available. None of this is simple, and it generally requires coordination, ideally with a financial planner or accountant who understands retirement-specific tax strategy. But the underlying point stands. $1 million managed with some degree of tax intelligence goes meaningfully further than $1 million managed without it. Pulling this together into something concrete, for someone retiring today with $1 million invested, a withdrawal rate somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 a year carries reasonable confidence of lasting through a 30-year retirement, assuming a balanced portfolio, before taxes are applied. If most of that money sits in traditional accounts, after-tax income likely falls somewhere between $28,000 and $35,000. Factor in Social Security, which applies to most retirees, and the picture shifts meaningfully. Even a modest $1,200 monthly benefit adds $14,400 a year and reduces the pressure on the portfolio, extending its lifespan considerably. Owning a home outright dramatically lowers monthly expenses compared to renting or carrying a mortgage into retirement. Retiring in a state without income tax, Florida, Texas, Nevada, and a handful of others, raises after-tax income compared to staying in a higher tax state. And maintaining flexibility. Spending a little less during years when the market is down rather than treating the 4% rule as an unbreakable law makes a portfolio significantly more resilient over time. $1 million is enough. For a great many people, in a great many situations, it is genuinely enough. But it is a number that rewards honesty. It rewards doing the real math rather than the optimistic version of it. It rewards flexibility, thoughtful geography, tax awareness, and perhaps most of all, a clear answer to the question of what a retired life is actually meant to look like. Here is the part worth carrying forward. Reaching $1 million is a genuinely remarkable accomplishment. Most people never get there. The discipline, the patience, the years spent prioritizing future security over immediate comfort, none of that is small. It is, in many ways, everything. None of what has been said here is meant to make that accomplishment feel smaller than it is. But perhaps the greatest gift available to anyone approaching that number, or already watching it sit in an account, is clarity. Not fantasy, not dread, simply a clear-eyed and honest look at what the money can actually do, what income it produces, what that income covers, where the real risks live, how Social Security fits into the picture, and what life genuinely feels like at 10 in the morning on an ordinary Wednesday in February with no work to go to. Retirement, in the end, is not really a number. It is a life. And the people who build the best version of it do not simply accumulate money, they accumulate intention. They know what they are retiring toward. They understand the math without being enslaved by it. They stay flexible when the market does whatever the market is going to do. And they have thought seriously enough about the non-financial pieces, the purpose, the community, the structure of ordinary days, that the money becomes a tool in service of something real, rather than simply a target aimed at for decades without ever pausing to consider what comes after it is finally hit. For anyone still on the path toward that number, the path is worth continuing. And for anyone who has already arrived, the work is not over. The smartest move at that point is not to finally relax, it is to finally start asking the right questions. If this gave you something worth thinking about, share what landed for you in the comments. And if there is a specific retirement scenario worth digging into next, leave that there as well. Like the video if it was useful, stay subscribed for more of this kind of thinking. And the next one will be along soon.